We've seen opposition research for decades. How does this compare? How does this size up?
With this contract, dock workers at those 29 Pacific ports will get a pay benefit and working conditions that I believe they deserve.
Today was a victory for Black Alabamians, but also for all Alabamians, because what we're fighting for is fairness.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We begin tonight with a CBS News exclusive. We have learned that many of the lies told by embattled New York Republican Congressman George Santos were captured in a Searing report commissioned by his own campaign a full year before his election. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins me now with that story. Scott, what I just read is what we call in the trade a grabber. Please explain.
This 100-plus page report was commissioned back in 2021. They actually contracted some professionals to do this research. The Santos campaign commissioned this research to get ahead of any potential negative stories. And it's a more than 100-page report. That's the cover shot. That there are so many pages is indicative of what this report was. A prequel, if not a preview, of the scandals that surround Congressman Santos. There are so many parallels in this internal opposition research report to the troubles Santos faces today, including the criminal charges. There are allegations in this internal report that surfaced at the Santos campaign's own commission that detail his potential improprieties with money, his lack of truthfulness about his life story, about his biography, about his family roots, claims about his grandparents being Holocaust survivors, his claims about having been married before. But more to the point, Major, the warning signs in this report were noted inside the Santos campaign. CBS News has learned that multiple campaign aides asked Santos to drop out of the race. When he refused to, those aides quit the job. They recognized what they were holding in that internal report.
And Scott, for those in our audience who may be unfamiliar with this, walk them through that this is something that lots of campaigns do. They don't wait for somebody else to ask hard questions or uncomfortable questions. They try to prepare themselves by digging into the candidate's past and unearthing things so they can be prepared. Correct?
In fact, some party leaders will insist on a candidate doing so. Some of these groups that help organize campaigns for the parties will say, if you want to become a candidate for federal office, you need to have an internal report on your own potential vulnerabilities. And if you think about it more fundamentally, Major, who's the best person to launch an investigation of problems in someone's life? That person, him or herself. They know best where to look and where to dig and what to try to reveal. Let's put that aside for a moment. These types of reports are not only done by the candidate, but they are often shared so that people are aware of what's happening with candidates that may be on the ballot. Our CBS News reporting indicates that this was circulated among some House Republican campaign leaders in Washington. At least the conclusions of this report were shared with those leaders. And we brought these questions about this type of vulnerability report, the power in this one. What did this one mean to an old campaign hand? Doug Heye is a veteran campaign strategist for the Republicans. Here's what he said about what this report included.
You've seen opposition research for decades. How does this compare? How does this size up?
We've seen resume padding before, but the whole host of very questionable things over and over again, and not just in one direction, but in seemingly every facet of his life, personal, professional, educational, turns out to be not just questionable, but an outright lie. That is staggering.
So, Scott, some people knew within the Santos campaign, some other Republicans knew. What does this do, if anything, to George Santos' status now?
George Santos is not only a particularly valuable vote for House Republicans with their very narrow majority, he's running for re-election, trying to win back this seat for the next term in Queens, in parts of Long Island. He's a particularly impactful vote in the U.S. House because Republicans can only lose 4 and win any party line vote. His federal criminal case is ongoing. There was supposed to be a court hearing tomorrow, Major, a status conference in that hearing. The prosecution and the defense have agreed to push that back to late October. And our CBS News read of the court documents that were filed over the past 24 hours indicates that there may be plea negotiations or at least a conversation about resolving this short of trial underway. So that court hearing was postponed by the judge to late October. Congressman Santos returns here Tuesday. He is still a voting member of the U.S. House, and a pretty impactful one at that.
The value of Scott's reporting is that George Santos just didn't become a matter of curiosity and consternation among House Republicans overnight. Lots of people knew, or at least had reason to know. That's why this story matters. Scott, I want you to catch our audience up on something else that happened on the other side of the Capitol today. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, met briefly with reporters. What did he have to say?
McConnell was asked point blank to detail what health issue is ailing him. What is the cause behind those two incidents in which he appeared to freeze up before cameras over the past few weeks? What McConnell did multiple times to reporters today was refer them to the doctor's note that his office released from the Capitol physician, saying that whatever the tests showed indicated there's no seizure disorder, there's no Parkinson's disease, there's no stroke. The first note from the doctor chalked some of this up potentially to the dehydration the senator might have been experiencing when those episodes happened, and the aftermath of the concussion he suffered in March. We talked to senators who were in the room with McConnell today who said that McConnell assured them that those two freezing up episodes were the only two he's experienced. They just so happened to have happened before television lights, television cameras, and rooms full of reporters. Most of the senators we talked to say they were reassured by what they heard from the senator today, and that they expect him to remain leader and that they will continue to support him as Republican leader.
Few in our business summarize better than Scott McFarland, but I want to give the audience a taste for themselves of what McConnell said and how he said it today. Let's play that.
What a doctor said is the precise medical reason for those two freeze-ups.
What Dr. Monahan's report addressed was concerns people might have that some things that happened to me did happen. Well, they didn't. And it's really, I have nothing to add to that.
What do you say to those who are calling on you to step down? Do you have any plans to retire anytime soon?
I have no announcements to make on that subject.
But what do you say to those who are...
I'm going to finish my term as leader, and I'm going to finish my Senate term.
Scott, briefly, any sense that you got from Republican senators today that either of those two things will not happen, that he'll be able to finish his term and remain leader?
There seems to be no shifting of the politics here, the political reality for Mitch McConnell. There's always been a small faction of Senate Republicans who've been trying to challenge him to install a different Republican leader, but he has the overwhelming majority of Senate Republicans still supporting him. And these health episodes and this new report from the Capitol physician don't seem to have budged that as this day ended.
Scott McFarland with valuable exclusive reporting and a summary of the ongoing curiosity about the condition of Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. Thanks so very much. Federal prosecutors say they plan to bring an indictment against Hunter Biden by late September. The exact charges, well, they remain unclear. The president's son has been under investigation in Delaware on gun and tax charges. Defense attorneys maintain that an agreement remains in place over that felony gun charge, but that gun charge was part of a plea deal for tax offenses that fell apart quite memorably back in July. President Biden often touts his ties to labor groups. We'll speak with an advisor to the AFL-CIO about the role unions will play in the 2024 presidential election. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Labor unions are proving to be a driving factor leading up to the 2024 presidential election. New polling from the AFL-CIO finds that 2/3 of all Americans support labor unions. 88% of those under the age of 30 said they believe in the power of union organizing. Ray Zaccaro joins us now. He's Director of Public Affairs for the AFL-CIO, and one of the things that means is there's probably nobody at the White House. He can't get on the phone pretty quickly. Ray, it's good to see you.
Major, it's so good to see you. It's been a while.
Ray, how would you describe the current state of the Biden re-election campaign?
Look, I think this president has the most remarkable record to run on. We've never seen a president in recent history that is as pro-labor as President Biden. And the fact is his record speaks for itself. But what I find really extraordinary is the uprise in popularity of labor unions that you just showed on that graphic from the poll that we released last week. It is a staggering number that 88% of people in America 30 and under are enthusiastically supportive of labor unions and this president. Look, Major, you've been covering politics a long time. You'd have to really search your memory bank to go back to find a president who used the word union in as many speeches as often as this president does.
Yes, I remember covering Bill Clinton. He didn't do it that often. He did, not under duress, but in selective places, selective audiences. President Obama leaned in a little bit more, but not nearly as much as President Biden.
Right. Well, I think President Biden's record is clear here, which is why we made an historic decision early on to endorse President Biden right away. And we had an extraordinary event in Philadelphia back in June where we saw it was a labor union member-driven event. Everybody that spoke there, with the exception of the President of the United States, were labor union members. The support across the board for President Biden with union members is very strong. But what's also strong is the support for unions across America. You know, we're seeing 71% of Americans support labor unions, support union activism right now. And I think that speaks to the political climate that we're in and why this president stands a really great chance of re-election because of the support of labor unions and his support of the working people in America.
Ray, to clarify, you don't harbor any anxiety whatsoever about the state of the energized part of the Biden-Harris re-election campaign, meaning its voter outreach, connection with Latinos, key constituencies within the party? Everything's Jake?
Well, look, we have an awful lot of work to do ahead of the election, which is why we got out so early. But there is no organization, there's no institution in America that has the ability to mobilize its people and its communities like the America's labor unions. What we see regularly, and it started happening already, is unions have an uncommon ability to be able to speak one-on-one with voters. They're going to be at your door. We're going to be in your community. We're going to be on the job site. And we can talk directly about why a president who unleashed $300 billion in spending to rebuild our nation's infrastructure is making it easier for Americans to be able to form labor unions as opposed to the past, where we saw a steady string of deregulation and changes to labor laws that made it harder for Americans to workers to speak up and form unions on the job. And people are noticing, look, we just came through a historic pandemic. People are very conscious of what American work looks like. We're also very conscious of the fact that there are some huge disparities in this country, and these are political issues. The fact that we just released a report a few days ago that showed that a CEO makes 272% more than the average worker. 270 years ago, that number was 20 times more than the average worker. This is 272 times the average worker. That's going to be an issue on Election Day. And that's going to be the kind of stuff that people are going to be knocking on doors. Union members are going to be talking to voters about, and union members who are voters too care deeply about those issues.
Ray, when you talk to other Democrats who are anxious, in some cases more so than anxious, deeply nervous about poll data that shows nationally and in some swing states, the president running even or slightly behind former President Trump, who right now, and I say right now, emphasizing that, is the front runner for the Republican nomination. And they see persistent data showing, even among Democrats, anxiety about the president's age and his ability to competently fill out a second term. What do you tell them? Do you share those anxieties, or are you like, don't worry about it, it's all good?
Well, look, you know, the AFL-CIO and labor unions aren't about Democratic or Republican candidates. What we're about is candidates who care about working people and are delivering. You have a president who has delivered historic gains for workers in this country. He's opening up a whole field of clean energy jobs that never existed before in this realm. Historic investments in bringing our economy up to the date that we're living in of the 21st century, and not to mention the fact that make prescription drug costs lower. These are the kind of kitchen table issues that people care deeply about, and I think that's what motivates voters. We see this all the time in elections. There's always a naysayer air quotient about the sky is falling and we're not going to field the right candidate. Fact is, President Biden has delivered in ways for American workers that no president before him in recent memory has. And I think our workforce knows that, because there are people in this country who are still reeling from the effects of the pandemic. And the fact is, they're seeing the economy improve day by day. It's improving every day for working people. What we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we take this historic amount of time that we have, we've never had this kind of lead time, and start informing voters and making sure that people understand just what's on the ballot this year. What's on the ballot is a candidate who will continue to fight for working people. What's on the ballot are issues that people care about every day that affect their pocketbooks and their families and their ability to organize and work and be recognized for the work that they do.
Ray, with about a minute to go, you know, in 2016, Hillary Clinton had all the endorsements, but labor support dropped from where it had been in the 2012 election and the 2008 election with President Obama. What's going to be different in 2024, and how do you make it so?
Well, I think we can go back to where we started this conversation, Major. 88% of people in this country 30 and under support this president. Across party lines, support labor unions, rather, support the union effort. And that mobilization of the unions in this country will be unlike any force we've ever seen in politics. We're fully committed. And that 88% of young Americans who are hearing our message, who are hearing the message of why it's so important to have a worker-centric economy, they are with us. Now, the job of unions, the job of everybody who's concerned about this upcoming election and our democracy is to get out and talk to those people who are receptive to the issues that matter most to American workers, America's families. And I will tell you this, just in closing, the enthusiasm right now that we're seeing for people who are out there working every day, we're seeing nine out of 10 Americans who are saying we support workers. It makes a difference, and we know who supports American workers too.
Ray Zuccaro, we thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Alabama's new congressional map has been rejected for a second time. How the lines will be redrawn and whether or not the Supreme Court will get involved. That after the break. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The impeachment trial of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton entered its second day today. Paxton is facing multiple accusations of bribery, obstruction of justice, and misusing power. Today, the Senate heard from Paxton's former Assistant Attorney General, Jeff Mateer, who resigned after accusing Paxton of breaking the law.
I concluded that Mr. Paxton was engaged in conduct that was immoral, unethical, and I had a good faith belief that it was illegal.
Paxton was impeached by a bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats in the Texas House. Paxton has pleaded not guilty. A federal court rejected Alabama's newly drawn congressional map for a second time on Tuesday. The unanimous decision comes just 3 months after the state's lawmakers ignored the panel's previous orders to include a second majority black district, or, quote, something quite close to it. Handilo Wong joins us now. He is a correspondent for National Public Radio with an expertise in redistricting and election-related issues. Handi, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. In essence, where do things stand in Alabama, and how much is this collision really one about whether the courts prevail, whether the state legislature prevails in deciding what district lines look like?
Well, where it stands right now in Alabama is that congressional map that the Republican-controlled state legislature passed in July has been struck down by these 3 federal judges. And they said they are deeply disturbed, they are troubled that the state legislature did not follow their order earlier to draw a map that includes 2 districts where Black Alabamians have a realistic opportunity of electing their preferred candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives. And in the state of Alabama, where voting is so racially polarized, 2 Black opportunity districts means you have to have 2 majority Black districts or something quite close to it, in the words of these judges. That's not what state legislature did. And they only drew 1 opportunity district for Black Alabamians. And now you have Alabama saying that they are planning to appeal this ruling, this new ruling from the three-judge court to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's coming just about 3 months after the Supreme Court already weighed in this case. And essentially, Alabama's already lost at the Supreme Court and were sent back to this three-judge court. But now Alabama's trying to get back to the Supreme Court and trying to get that state legislature-approved map in place for the next year's elections.
Right. And Hansi, separate from whatever the Supreme Court may or may not do, as I understand it, a special master has been assigned to create new lines by September 25th. Is that correct?
That's right. The three-judge court has appointed experts to come up with 3 different proposals that would replace the map that's been struck down. And we're going to see a potential hearing in early October if there are any objections to those proposals. And ultimately, the court is preparing to pick a map that would be used for 2024. But in a kind of a parallel track, you have this appeal to the Supreme Court. And the question is, will the Supreme Court be willing to step in again and weigh and potentially pause this lower court's ruling and potentially pause this process with these court-appointed map drawers?
There's also something happening in litigation over district lines in the neighboring state of Georgia. Catch us up on that, if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, there's a related case in Georgia. There's also a related case in Louisiana. They're also, just like in Alabama, cases about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and also about maps being approved, congressional maps, without an adequate number of majority Black districts, according to the federal courts. And also to these challengers of these maps. And so it's likely, given how the Supreme Court ruled back in June in this Alabama case, upholding its past rulings on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that all these states, unless the Supreme Court changes its mind, all these states are on the path to having more majority Black districts in time for the 2024 elections. And ultimately, that could mean that you might see more Democrats elected from these southern states. And, it's a very thin majority that the Republicans hold right now in the U.S. House. And those additional Democratic pickups could help the Democrats win back the majority in the U.S. House after next year's elections.
Hansi, as you well know, people who are debating about the viability of the Voting Rights Act sometimes say that it was gutted by an earlier Supreme Court decision. You've mentioned Section 2 a couple of times. That clearly is an operative part of the Voting Rights Act. Briefly explain what Section 2 does and why it matters in all the states you've just mentioned.
The Supreme Court did gut a key section of the Voting Rights Act, but what remains still is this really key part known as Section 2. There are a lot of protections there for voters of color to ensure that when lines are redrawn after a census, those voting maps are redrawn, that the power of voters of color is not suppressed, that they're able to vote and have a realistic opportunity to elect candidates of their choice based on these redistricting plans. And so this has been a very key section and used in a lot of litigation as part of the redistricting process, frankly. And it's a way to ensure that the power of voters, specifically voters of color, is not diminished, is not diluted. One thing I should mention is that there is another lawsuit I'm tracking out of Arkansas, which is questioning who can actually bring these Section 2 lawsuits. So this is a potential way to potentially gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It's a lawsuit that really throws into question whether or not private individuals can bring these lawsuits. And the thing to keep in mind is the majority of Section 2 lawsuits, including many of the lawsuits we've been talking about in Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana, brought by private individuals. But now there is a ruling from a district court judge, a Trump appointee, that says that these private individuals do not have a right to bring these lawsuits. And it's potentially heading to the Supreme Court in the coming months.
Who has standing and what that standing might or might not represent in a court of law as it regards to state district lines. Hansi Lo Wang with National Public Radio. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That does it for today. Thank you so much for watching. You're streaming CBS News.